right-thinking members of society is a legal concept coming from the common law. Its formulation was intended to give legal voice to the concept of the reasonable person. It is particularly relevant in libel trials when you would get a jury trial to allow the claimant or the complainant, I forget the exact term now, but the person complaining about being libelled would have the benefit of a jury trial because it was considered insufficient for a judge to say, well, I think this, and I am a reasonable man. So they always had a jury to decide whether the words used against the person complaining about libel actually had the effect of libeling the person. So the test was bringing a person into hatred, ridicule, and contempt. And obviously these terms had to be in common usage and be understood by the ordinary person to be defamatory or not defamatory, depending on, whichever way the jury decided. And for this reason, libel trials were horribly expensive. It could only be begun in the High Court, presumably on the assumption that, it's got to really bother you for you to start an action in the High Court, and you had to be reasonably certain of winning the action for you to be so hot under the collar that you would invest such a huge amount in legal costs to get your name cleared. But these trials could be ruinously expensive. And I'm just explaining to you before the law changed what the standard was. So to sue somebody successful for libel, you had to prove that what was said about you would bring you into hatred, ridicule, and contempt in the eyes of right-thinking members of society. And then the law changed so that it was no longer required for you to have a jury trial because, well, I guess I was saying, well, you could do it cheaply if you don't go before a jury because, in front of a jury, you have to go over points again and again, to make sure the jury got the point, and it'll take so long, and, and you might not even get the result you wanted. But if you went just before a judge alone, you'll be more likely to understand the issues, and those were the arguments. And so the idea of the right-thinking member of society was implicitly repealed almost, because we know that Sally Bercow was sued for libel when she tweeted a funny face when she heard that Lord McAlpine had been named as one of the suspects, I think, in relation to a libel, in relation to something to do with paedophiles. And all she did was tweet a funny face and say, I wonder I actually can't remember, but an emoji of a funny face was tweeted, and the judge decided that she had libelled Lord McAlpine. Was was that judge in question a right-thinking member of society? Well, there have been famous trials when a judge had not heard of the Beatles, and this was considered very ignorant, obviously not an ordinary person. And so it could be said that judges were not really right-thinking members of society, or not ordinary members of society, and their view would be contrary to the view of the man on the Clapham omnibus. This is again an old-fashioned term to talk about ordinary members of society who might, be on public transport, that sort of thing. Not somebody with a chauffeur-driven car, or a private jet, or a you get the idea. Unfortunately, when this right to a libel trial was abolished, I think so was it abolished the idea of the right-thinking member of society. And this is a subject that got me thinking about who would be a right-thinking member of society. Presumably to be selected for jury service, there's certain criteria. You mustn't be, you actually mustn't be a lawyer. You mustn't be somebody who understands the intricacies of the legal system. But really, the idea is that you must be an ordinary member of society, and of course, you must be respectable. You can't be a criminal, because that you wouldn't be a right-thinking member of society if you were a criminal. But in our turbulent times, who is a right-thinking member of society? Is it enough to say, well, this person hasn't been convicted of a crime, and that means that they are a right-thinking member of society? But if you think in terms of the context of history, would Victorians think that the British now are right-thinking members of society, or indeed if there are any right-thinking members of society, if we live in a society that has a government that is intent on banning conversion therapy, on having legalized gay marriage after having legalized the civil partnership, after having legalized no-fault divorce, and in effect collectively condoned underage sex in the 1980s, when it was decided in the House of Lords that it would be okay for family doctors to give underage female adolescents access to the pill and abortions without, and contraceptives, of course, without having to inform parents of these minors what they are in effect doing. And the litigant in this case was a Catholic woman, Victoria Gillick, who said, well, that doctors who gave contraception to underage girls were in fact aiding and abetting underage sex. But the House of Lords actually said this was okay. So this was in the 1980s. And in my view, this is the consequence of the Asian grooming gangs was inevitable, because if you can put underage girls on the pill without the consent of their parents, then you would leave them vulnerable to exploitation by child prostitution gangs. And this was what indeed happened in Rochdale and Rotherham. And this was really an accident waiting to happen. So can British society, as it now is, be with its Prime Minister who refuses to tell us exactly how many children he has, can we be a right-thinking nation? I don't think so. Is any Western nation a right-thinking nation when it is collectively afflicted by the policies of globo homo, which are in effect the policies of Sodom and Gomorrah? And for this reason, I think the concept of the right-thinking member of society has been implicitly repealed and made extinct. I know a lot of people don't really care. But the only reason why this is happening is because Western nations don't have a functioning moral system, at least effective at maintaining minimum standards of sexual morality, and this is why everything is going wrong with incompetent and corrupt politicians dictating national policy that is obviously insane. There are many other signs that our society is not fully functioning or is even rational. I mean, first you have to be all three, haven't you? You're really, if you aspire to be a decent person, you would have to have a strict regard for truth. You would have to show that you are capable of logical thinking, and also that within the parameters of what is logical to do, you will not do what is immoral. And obviously, you would have to adhere to a moral system that tells you what is permitted and what isn't. And in Western society, there are no permanent parameters of what is permissible to do or not, because what you find you were able to do last year, you may no longer be allowed to do this year, and if you want an explanation, you won't get one. So this is ultimately the problem of Western nations when the rule of law has broken down, when no law is perceived as permanent, that they are numerous. Laws are numerous, and it was Seneca who said that the more numerous the laws, the more corrupt the state. So this sort of thing has happened before in history, and we are obviously having to relearn the lessons of history when the rule of law breaks down after a moral collapse, which can be objectively measured by the fact that the standards of sexual morality is obviously lowered. How are we to measure standards of sexual morality? And I put it to you that it can be only made through marriage, and how many people practice it and how many people stay married. And this, of course, is linked to the crime rate of your society. And the fact that nobody will talk about it, nobody will discuss it, even people complaining about the government won't talk about it, is further evidence of things being not quite right. The other thing I wanted to talk about is moral hierarchy. This was something I mentioned yesterday. What is moral hierarchy? I don't think it's possible to have such a thing as a moral hierarchy without at least entertaining the possibility that the hypothetical supreme authority might exist. And by this I mean the Abrahamic God. So even if you don't actually believe in him, you must, at some level, imagine a court, a Supreme Court that always gives justice. And while we know that no such court, no such Supreme Court exists on earth now, because however good it is, we have to assume that, every now and then it makes errors, and that there are miscarriages of justice because we are flawed, we make mistakes. In our reasoning, we rely on information that is false. We misinterpret a moral principle, something of that nature. And therefore, even if we are atheist, we have to assume that there exists an ideal world. We say that, don't we, when we, in a normal discourse, we say, in an ideal world, such and such wouldn't happen. And we also talk about best case scenarios where, all that we hope for happens and all that we hope won't happen, didn't happen, wouldn't happen. So really, even as we are atheists and we talk about an ideal situation or a best case scenario, we are, in our own way, reaching out towards God. And this is necessary because we need to prioritize the different what shall I say? The different orders of authority. And when we reason correctly, we will get the desired result that we want. And I'm saying I basically worked it out for you in that if you think that the rule of law is breaking down in the West, i.e. you don't think that the laws in existence are the best laws or enforced evenly or good for your society, you have to think of what the solution to this problem is. And I'm saying there are ways of thinking to solve the problem. So, I mean, I would say if matriarchy is a problem, then patriarchy must be the solution. If patriarchy is the destination, then theocracy must be the vehicle. And you may not like this and you may disagree with me, and you would have to come up with an argument about why I'm wrong. So this is how rational discourse, this is a course that rational discourse would take. And if you can't find anything better, then my argument has a higher status to your my rational argument has a higher status to your irrational argument, but you might have a sound argument or even a better moral argument, and this is how we work out which argument is better than the other one. So we need to work out which argument is better and the reasons why. So orders of thinking would be whether an argument is based on true information, and then we work out whether the logic used based on this information is the conclusion made based on this information is logical and moral. So that's how people would work it out. And I think the first two is sort of easy enough. But what is moral is, again, a controversial question in the West, because no Westerner really defines morality, and I don't think they want to, because just because it would make things more simple, and they don't want to make things simple. They want to make things opaque and ambiguous, so they can use the uncertainty to push through their own agenda. And one of the things I've noticed today, while talking to Avril, is that there is a general dislike of rules by many people because they think they're too cool for rules. They just prefer, spirituality and, this kind of vague, happy stuff that has nothing to do with following rules, which they find insulting because it reminds them of school or something. But then, if you don't have rules, then people will just do what the hell they like. And when they do what the hell they like for long enough, things will start going wrong pretty rapidly. And we've kind of got to the stage now where things are going wrong very quickly indeed and getting worse very quickly. So is there a way of getting out of this? I think in theory there is, because obviously we need to know what the problem is, and then we think of the solution. So, it's like having a map. You've taken the wrong turning, you know you're not where you want to be, but as long as you can find out where you are on the map, and if the map is accurate, you can, maybe still get back to your intended destination. But to get back on track, you need to know where the hell you're supposed to be going, and also you need to know where you are before you can work out which way to turn. It is difficult, though, when you don't know, when you don't have a moral hierarchy, or even a social hierarchy, so you know who is above you and who you can um, go to sort your problems out. I know in theory there are, politicians, but, we don't trust them, so we just don't go to them, and we know, they don't have much power, and we don't think they could solve the problem, so we don't bother, and problems fester. But going back to my point about right-thinking members of society, we can have no right-thinking members of society if we don't have a moral system. And because we don't have a moral system, people really won't know which way to go about doing the right thing or correcting errors. Yes, Mark Smith, right thinking would be moral, rational, well, honest, logical, and moral. That's what I'd say it is. So Louis the 17th. Yes, the more technologically advanced we are, the more diverse we can be. But then we also have the technology to, keep tabs on lots of people. So it's not that difficult. I mean, what is difficult now is that we know that the laws are wrong. And because most people think the laws are wrong, they don't trust the government, and so they won't cooperate with the government. But if most people felt that the laws are fair enough and that the right people are in charge, then they would trust the government and they would cooperate with the government. And then things would just work so much more smoothly. But what is disturbing is that because of the change in the law and the Defamation Act, I forget which year it was now. 20, oh, it says 2013, and this one in 2009. It's 2013. So it reformed English defamation law, but it goes against the principles of natural justice because it deprives people of the right to a jury trial, because sometimes the judge is just going to be wrong on whether something said is liable to bring somebody into hatred, ridicule, and contempt. And since we don't have any fixed moral standards on so many things now, you just wouldn't be able to find anyone like that. And it's, well, sad as well as rather alarming. And this is all I wanted to say, really. Mark Smith is accusing me of well, it says no, no, no. This is not what I think is the intended effect of God if he exists. So my thesis is simply this: that there will come a future time when Jews finally realize that they don't want to be Jews anymore, because if they're being logical about their belief system, they would have to accept that the Torah contains 36 capital offenses which have not been rescinded by God. So they're still live, He never said, Jews, don't worry about the 36 capital offences now. I've decided that they no longer apply to you. He didn't say that at all. But according to history, in the chronology of the Abrahamic faith, you know that Judaism came first. Without Judaism, there would be no Jews. Without Jews, there would be no Jesus for Christians to worship, and without Christianity, there would be no need for the correction of Islam. So this is basically the narrative, and Christianity is obviously idolatry and blasphemy, and we know that Christians can't explain how Jesus is God. They've had 2,000 years to do that, and they can't. It's nonsense. So they won't. They can never explain nonsense. I mean, they can threaten to kill people who question them, and that was what they did in the past. So when the American Republic was founded and gave its citizens the right to freedom of worship and freedom of expression, this is something that immediately created a desire in countries that were not America to have the same thing. And so eventually Europe had that. We have the European Convention of Human Rights giving us, the right to freedom of belief and freedom of worship, but, it doesn't really work that well. It's one of those laws that, we were supposed to have, but actually, because of cancel culture, we know it doesn't work, right? So this is a problem. You can have any kind of law that is, fair enough, but if it's not actually enforced, then it's not worth the paper it's written on. So the problem then is that of enforcement and application. And if our political establishment is corrupt, if the judges are corrupt, if the legislature, the politicians who pass laws are corrupt, then we will be suffering injustice. So what would better regulate the morals of our politicians? It's obviously through rules that are, basically set in stone. You can't say, here's this brilliant man, make him dictator and everything will be all right. And it might be all right for a bit, but what happens after he is dead? So it's not enough to trust in a man, however charismatic and brilliant, because he will go the way of all flesh, which is to die. And therefore you need something that will endure beyond the lifespan of this mortal man. And for that reason you need scripture. And it can't be any old scripture. It's got to come from the highest possible authority. Do you see where I'm getting at now? But really, what's so difficult about it, really, when you think the Abrahamic God only revealed two sets of scripture, the first being the Torah for Jews, and the second and final being the Quran for Gentiles? And it's like, that's it. What's so hard about that? And obviously the New Testament doesn't count because well, it's just the testimony of mortal and fallible men of dubious provenance. So it's like, well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, who are they? They were only mortal and fallible men, and the New Testament wasn't even from Jesus. So, it's obviously inferior scripture compared to the Torah and the Quran. And, it's so obvious, isn't it? That because God, in his wisdom, divided humanity into Jews and Gentiles, and only I think 0.1% of humanity are Jewish. So, you wouldn't be using the Torah. And in fact, if you were being logical, you would, as a Jew, want to, and knew that you had to choose between one or the other, you would have to choose the Quran. Because, you want to be subject to the lower standard just because you would be rational. You want to lead a less restrictive life and you want a more attractive heaven, and you don't want to be faced with all kinds of undischarged death penalties when you go and meet your maker, assuming that you won't be punished for the 36 capital offences within your Jewish life. So logic would dictate that Jews convert to Islam if they believed in the afterlife. But do they really? Or perhaps they haven't reached the stage of thinking yet. And in the end, it all boils down to having the right set of principles from the right kind of moral system. But why should it be so difficult if there are only two? And one is obviously for Jews, which is so much more restrictive and harsher, and the other one is for humanity in general and isn't in any way as harsh as the Torah. What prevents people from coming to the obvious conclusion? I suppose it must be stubbornness and pride. So Louis the 17th, you say, Americans don't have freedom of worship nor any freedom of expression. Is it really that bad? I mean, why don't you? I think it's because you are a matriarchy. You have an illegitimacy rate of 40%. In Canada, it is 50%. In the UK, it's higher than that. So it is obviously true that Western nations are basically matriarchies. And once you acknowledge that, the solution becomes so obvious, doesn't it? So, Mark Smith, are you Christian? You're not really, are you? You're not properly Christian unless you believe that Jesus is God. What I'm seeing here is, I'm not changing my ways, which means that you're saying you're not admitting your errors. And I guess that means you're not correcting them. So if you're not correcting your errors, and what you continue to suffer, what you suffer, you will continue to suffer. And it's not static either. If you think of it as being on the Titanic and you've hit your iceberg, and You can't really pretend that you hadn't hit your iceberg, and if you ignore it, it'll just get worse. And, the ship is listing, and, eventually it's going to sink. And what are you saying? You're basically saying, I'm just going to pretend that, that, that nothing's wrong. You're not Canada yet. So you think Canada is much worse, do you? Louis XVII asks, how is Quran the solution? Well, why not? You don't have to speak Arabic. You can read the Quran in an English translation. So the freak is, well, basically a Christian fanatic. He's completely set on Jesus. So I don't think he can be reasoned with. But, for other people who think, well, maybe there's something wrong with Christianity, then there might be hope for you. I don't have to be Muslim to see the kind of reasoning Muslims use. I don't have to be Jewish to understand Jewish reasoning. And in fact, Millennial Woes was answering a question on his AMA about agnostics who promote theocracy. So, sounds like my ideas are getting round. Great, Mark Smith. You don't have to be Christian. You don't. What you need to do is simply understand how to go about your business as somebody who wants to be considered to be honest and logical and moral. That's what you want the people to think you are, isn't it? And if you want to be thought moral, you'd have to declare your principles. And it just saves time to say, your religion, right? Once you say what your religion is, then people will know what you are supposed to be. Not, they won't assume that you would be the perfect Jew or the perfect Muslim, but they would expect you to, pay lip service at least to the principles of your religion. So if you say you're Christian, then they would expect you to agree that Jesus is God. And I'm saying there isn't much of a choice, and that is actually a good thing because it makes things so much simpler, doesn't it? Mark Smith doesn't want to follow me in my plan, but what does he intend to follow instead? We don't know. So Louis XVII is a Christian, is he? So the freak was Muslim. That's interesting. So why didn't you stay Muslim? Was it because you didn't like hanging out with immigrants? And is that the problem? It's not really obviously you like the belief system to convert, and then you thought, well, I have to go to mosque, and then you didn't like the way they treated you, or what? I think you just returned to Christianity in a fit of fanaticism because you just hated being with those brown people, right? Who had all the who didn't give you a wife, probably. So you had no reason to continue going to mosque. I imagine that's a reason why you fell out of it. But secular Quranism would give white people in the West a sense of creating their own version of Islam. And I think that's the most important thing about it. It will give Westerners ownership of Islam, because it would give them the opportunity to mold Islam to their culture, using their intellectual traditions, etc. Because otherwise you people are in trouble, aren't you? If you don't correct the problem. I mean, I know a lot of people are pretty apathetic, but that's because they're childless bachelors, aren't they? They don't really have anything to fight for. They just hope that the shit hits a fan after they are dead. So I want to deal with the deliberate misunderstanding that Mark Smith is always putting out. He's obviously a Christian chauvinist. He knows it doesn't work, and he doesn't believe in it himself, but he wants to cling to the religion of his ancestors because he hates the immigrants who are Muslim, whose religion he fears. But then if he gets over his fear, and if he examines his conscience and asks himself if he really does believe in the Abrahamic God, and if he does, then it would be perfectly logical for God, if he exists, to punish Christians by sending Muslims to them to make them, change from, give up the idolatry and blasphemy of Christianity. It's only logical, isn't it? God forbade idolatry and blasphemy, and if you're practicing that after 2,000 years, then you must expect some kind of payback. If God exists, if you believe in such a thing. So I find it curious that people can't work these things out for themselves. But I know the thinking of Western man is very disordered. Where does it say? Where does the Quran says Christians are superior? You're just making things up, aren't you? So the freak just has lots of contradictory beliefs. He believes that Jesus is. Oh, I don't even know what he believes, but sometimes he makes sense, but if you put the whole package of what he believes, it's complete nonsense. So I don't know. I mean, I'm talking to people who are basically half mad anyway. All right, now he says he's seen God, so we know that what kind of person we're talking to. Occasionally he makes sense, but I guess I'm talking to mentally disordered people most of the time who can't actually engage with me on a sustained basis on any matter. And I suppose that's why they avoid me. probably because they know that their positions don't make sense, but they still want to hold on to them anyway. But I guess I've been talking for long enough, and I'll probably go to bed soon. So thank you for listening.